Hi, and welcome to the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. The Salon Lecture Series is an educational outreach program of Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. Beacon is a nonprofit liberal arts school and America's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating students who learn differently. In its third season, the Beacon Salon Lecture Series presents periodic lectures from September to April that feature Beacon College faculty addressing compelling subjects in their respective liberal arts fields. We double down on that promise with a unique peek into pachyderms. In her lecture, Pachyderms and People, the complex situation surrounding animal tourism in Nepal, Michelle Szydlowski examines the captive elephant tourism that has been a mainstay of Chitwan National Park in Nepal since the 1960s. These elephants live a much different life than their wild counterparts and are often seen by local people as an entirely different animal. You'll walk with Szydlowski through the jungles and stables of Nepal and hear the biographies of unique individual elephants while learning about the extremely complex situation surrounding animal tourism in Nepal. Michelle Szydlowski is an anthrozoologist earning her Ph.D. researching ethics, conservation, and animal welfare in the Chitwan National Park area of Nepal. Her experience working with elephant drivers, conservationists, and communities in Nepal since 2012 gives her a unique insight into the issues surrounding international conservation projects. A former high school teacher, she left the classroom to pursue a career in animals which followed a winding path through veterinary technology, wild bird rehabilitation, and conservation. Having finally found the perfect career where all her passions unite, she teaches anthrozoology, ecology, and animal shelter management classes at Beacon College. And now, the Beacon Salon Lecture Series is proud to present Michelle Szydlowski.
Thanks, Daryl. First off, anthrozoology is an interdisciplinary field combining zoology, anthropology, veterinary medicine, history, and a myriad of other things. My own work typically focuses on both pachyderms and the small Asian country of Nepal. This lecture today is meant to feel part travelogue or photo essay and part research presentation. As you can see on this slide, Nepal is sandwiched between the Tibetan region of China and the country of India. Despite its location between these two large powers, Nepal has never been formally colonized. But one of the last Gorkha leaders did refer to Nepal as a yam between two rocks. All right, a few tidbits about Nepal. Nepal is about 60% the physical size of the UK, with about half the population. Or those people who live on the east coast of the US, Nepal is about the size of New York, but has about 10 million more people. It's full of World Heritage sites, including 7 groups of monuments in the Kathmandu Valley, many of which were destroyed by the large earthquake in 2015. The fascinating thing about Nepal is that 2/3 of the country is set aside for conservation and biodiversity preservation. Nepal is a biodiversity hotspot that's very important to the global preservation of biodiversity because the land rises from just a few feet above sea level all the way up to nearly 30,000 feet, Mount Everest. This offers a massive diversity of biomes and diverse environments such as grasslands, riverine forest, saw forest, broadleaf forests, valleys, tundra, and even some glaciers. Nepal is key to conservation efforts because they have a large number of endangered, threatened, and vulnerable species, including about 25 species of threatened mammals, 27 species of threatened birds, and about 5 endangered or threatened reptile species. I have a few pictures of some of these endangered species. The pygmy hog, the fishing cat, and the Bengal tiger are all important to species conservation in Nepal. And one of my favorites, the gharial crocodile, very limited numbers, and Nepal has been working for years on reintroducing farmed gharial crocodiles back into the wild. Of course, it's also the home to the greater one-horned rhinoceros. About 640 of these individuals live in Nepal, which is a huge portion of the only around 4,000 individuals that are left throughout the world. And of course, Nepal is home to the Asian elephant, which is the focus of a lot of my studies. Now, when most people think of Nepal, they think about what you see on this slide, the Great Himalaya, the Annapurna Range, seen here, which is where you might find Everest, which reaches that nearly 30,000 feet that I mentioned before. But there is a lot more to Nepal. One of the most fascinating aspects of Nepal is the Kathmandu Valley. It sits about 4,000 feet above sea level, and is one of the oldest cities on the entire Earth. They think it was founded about 9,000 BC. Over 1 million people and nearly as many animals live in this small mountain valley that is only about 220 square miles. The Kathmandu Valley is a very unique place, home to a multitude of shrines, temples, and species. Nepal is known for the tradition of intricate wooden carved doors and windows, as you can see in this photo, and unique shrines which have both Hindu and Buddhist temples, reliquaries, and monuments sharing one space. Here's an example of some of the famous pagodas of Kathmandu, a building style that one expects to find in Japan, but very few people realize is found throughout Nepal. And some photos of a few of Kathmandu's famous residents, all resting among the large human population. We have a young cow lying in a pile of trash, a goat and a dog both enjoying some shade of the temples, and of course this dog showing what he thinks of these reliquaries and prayer flags. Most of the shrines in Kathmandu do house a large number of macaques, and here are just a few resting at the monkey temple. The monkey temple is thought to be over 2,000 years old. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the more popular tourist destinations in Nepal. This photo, I just wanted to demonstrate that I am a big fan of intercultural exchange, but I also have OCD. I had no idea that this hair was going to end up wrapped around my body, and as my expression shows, I am trying very hard to fake my smile. But Nepal is so much more than just the highlands. The triarch landscape of Nepal is vitally important to conservation. It sits just above sea level, about 600 feet, and before the 1960s, it was uninhabitable to anyone but the native Taru people because they had an innate defense against malaria. And in the 1960s, the government of Nepal asked the US government to help them eradicate malaria, which was successful, but now nearly 6.7 million human residents call the triarch landscape home, which has had a very large impact on the animal species that live there. The triarch landscape contains the national parks in which these greater one-horned rhinos, tiger, pygmy hog, Asian elephants are found. On this slide, you can see my field sites, which are in the national parks of Nepal along the Terai on the south end, Royal Chitwan National Park and Royal Bardia National Park. Chitwan National Park was the first Nepali national park. It's the home to the town of Saraha, which is the main entry point to Chitwan. Saraha houses only about 2,600 people permanently, but sees over 150,000 visitors every year, thanks to the biodiversity of Chitwan. Just a few photos to let you see what Chitwan National Park looks like. It's got a wide variety of landscapes. This is some elephant grass looking across the river. Here is a herd of spotted deer, which are very common in Nepal. A vulnerable reptile species, the marsh mugger crocodile, which can get up to 450 pounds. A lizard. And of course, the rhesus macaques and langur monkeys, which are all over Nepal. And I mustn't forget the greater one-horned rhino. This is a mother and a baby resting in the jungle. One of the areas where I work in Chitwan National Park is the NTNC's Biodiversity Conservation Center. I have been very lucky to work with several orphaned, endangered greater one-horned rhinos. This is Biru, one of the first rhino I met in Nepal. And here's a photo of my very first wild animal attack ever. This is Biru, who thought that I was quite tasty and wanted to take a little nibble of my pants. And this is a photo of Bongi, another one of the juvenile rhino that I had the opportunity to work with in Nepal. Bongi was washed away in a flood. They were unable to find his mother, so they brought him to the Biodiversity Conservation Center to be raised. I took some up-close photos of Bongi because he is so adorable. Here is a baby Bongi belly button, for those of you that may never have seen a rhino belly button before. You will notice that Bongi is blue in a lot of these photos. He really likes to rub up against the sides of the building, and so he is typically green or blue or yellow, depending on the day. And originally, both of these juvenile rhino were meant to be re-released back out into the wild. Sadly, thanks to a lot of human impacts on these juveniles, they were unreleasable. They became too accustomed to humans. Bongi actually perished in a flood 2 years ago when the Rapti River overflowed, and they had nowhere to take him to preserve him. So he inhaled a lot of water and ended up passing. This is a photo of a habit that the baby rhinos get into at the conservation center. They are not allowed inside the buildings. So a lot of times what they do is they go right up to the entrance and they lay down across the front end so that nobody can go past them without petting them. So this is a photo when I went back in 2019. I was able to visit Biro and Bongi at the Central Zoo, and these are the best photos that I could get of the two of them because they were very excited to see me. So there's a lot of nose and lip shots here. I've also been fortunate enough to work with some more rhino and other juveniles. This is Dozier, who is a wild boar who was orphaned, brought in by a villager to the Biodiversity Conservation Center, and Mayure, another infant rhino who's lost his mother in a flood. So this is what I call hardly working. Bottle feeding a baby wild boar is not exactly hard work. Just some more adorable photos for you. Which of course leads me finally into the elephants, which are the main topic of my research in Nepal. Nepalese have shared their lives with elephants for thousands and thousands of years. Elephants were used as war elephants. They were used as a sign of wealth. They were a representation of a physical embodiment of the god Ganesha. And today these elephants find themselves sort of in a strange place. They're fiercely protected in the wild, but in captivity they're treated more as indentured servants. Elephants in Nepal suffer from a lack of biological research because the numbers of elephants in Nepal are so low. There's only about 150 wild elephants left and only about 112 captive elephants. So when you compare this to the 4,000 elephants in Thailand, there's a reason that researchers are flocking to Thailand, India, Myanmar to do research, and less so in Nepal. Okay. All wildlife in Nepal is owned by the government, and this includes a lot of the juveniles who are orphaned. The government of Nepal decides where they get to go. Some of these juveniles are transferred out of the country and into zoos. Some are re-released into the wild. But the interesting thing about this oversight is that because of an old law, the government of Nepal can pass along responsibility for this oversight to any NGO of its choosing. So right now, it is the National Trust for Nature Conservation that is in charge of managing all of the wildlife in the country. The National Trust for Nature Conservation has been described as a quasi-governmental NGO, and for some reason they have also been tasked with taking care of all of the privately owned elephants in Saraha. These privately owned elephants are used in tourist safari. They are owned usually by hoteliers, and the reason that these elephants are taken care of by the veterinary staff at the NTNC is because there was no one else to do it back in the 60s and 70s. So there was an agreement made that the National Trust for Nature Conservation would take over the care, and the owners of these elephants pay a small fee monthly to gain this veterinary care. It's really interesting to note that tourist safari has not really been in place for very long in Nepal. It's only been since about the 1960s. But if you talk to any of the elephant owners, they'll tell you it's been going on for thousands of years. Before COVID, there were about 52 privately owned elephants, 60 elephants that were owned by the NTNC and the government, and these are your patrol and safari elephants. and about 40 other captive elephants. Some of those are privately owned but kept in chain-free facilities. Some are just private herds. And all 160 of these individuals are taken care of by a single veterinarian and a single veterinary tech working for the National Trust for Nature Conservation. Now, as you might expect, the number of these elephants has gone down during the COVID pandemic. Many of these elephants were leased from India and have been set back across the border to their original owners. Others have been sold to India for less fee than probably they were purchased for. Prices are dropping, but prices are still quite ridiculous. So to buy an adult elephant and bring it into Nepal is about 90,000 US dollars. The average income in Nepal is about $1,000 a year. So those who can afford to buy elephants typically are hoteliers, business owners, very rich individuals. Okay. So my most recent work, my PhD work, is actually looking at the conservation, care, and ethics in Nepal and how these conservation groups, including the government, the National Trust for Nature Conservation, can become involved in welfare and health of these captive elephants. I combined research from 2012 to the present. I've been to Nepal 4 times, and I've conducted hundreds of interviews and thousands of emails have been sent just to get the data for this study. I did spend time embedded with mahouts in Nepal, following the veterinary staff around, and spent a lot of time chatting with elephant owners to try to get a sense of how they viewed elephants in Nepal. I first started working in Nepal because I have been involved in pachyderms at zoos for several years. My very first animal love was a river hippopotamus named Bert that I met somewhere around 1972. And a friend of mine with whom I was working at the Denver Zoo told me there was somebody I really needed to meet because he took trips to Nepal as sort of an exchange of information. I called it in my first work a relational tourism experience. And that was the only purpose, was to go meet people and support conservation efforts that are already happening in that country. And that is exactly what I did. So in 2012 was my first trip to Nepal. I simply went out, I met people who were involved in conservation. I met people who were involved in victims assistance, so helping victims of human-wildlife conflict. I met conservationists that are camera trapping, working with hyena, working with greater one-horned rhino. And I also met some anti-poaching patrol folks who asked us if we would help them get some motorcycles to make anti-poaching patrols easier, which we did. Another aspect of the conservation group with whom I'm associated in Nepal is beehive fencing. And what we do is we support local marginalized communities building beehive boxes, which they then use in areas of high elephant-human conflict, because elephants don't really like bees. The beehives are very noisy and the elephants tend to avoid them. So if you lay out these beehives, then often you'll have the elephants taking a different path. The lovely part of it is that these smaller communities can then sell this honey at a profit to help support families in the area that are really struggling, especially during times of COVID when there's no tourism. So after my first trip to Nepal, I had always wanted to go to grad school and had never quite made it there yet. So after my first trip to Nepal, I decided that it was time I started pursuing further education, and I really wanted to focus on greater one-horned rhino. So I undertook a master's degree program researching how ecotourism can positively impact greater one-horned rhino conservation. As part of these studies, I followed around some ecotourist groups, including the one that I'm involved with, and I started talking to people with their perceptions on conservation and did they think ecotourism was helpful or not helpful. So I interviewed a lot of Americans, Canadians, veterinary staff, zoo personnel, and then local community people in Nepal to kind of get a sense for how these smaller conservation groups that want to do ecotourism travel can really assist in countries. And that's how I got hooked up with the National Trust for Nature Conservation and the veterinary staff in Nepal. And that's what I did my master's degree on. When it came time to do my PhD, My intention was to return to Nepal and study greater one-horned rhinos in more detail, especially with an eye toward rehabilitating these juvenile rhinos and getting them to be sort of community rhinos, where they don't necessarily disappear off into the forest, but they sort of hang around the area. They do tend to draw in tourists. So I went to Nepal with that plan. That was my initial topic. And when I got to Nepal was when I realized that the conversation was changing, that there was no longer this feeling of elephant-back tourism is here to stay. There was some discontent among young people especially that the way elephants were treated in Nepal was no longer an acceptable way to treat a very emotional, very family-oriented, very social creature. And that's when I decided to lower my expectations on the greater one-horned rhino side of things and take up the mantle of studying elephants. And I ended up very connected in that area. My work in Nepal also involved visiting 25 of the approximately 40 private stables and assessing them for different types of health and welfare indicators. This photo is an example of a typical government stable. This is the breeding center in Kosara. And the breeding center is where female elephants are held to be mated with the wild male elephants. And these wild male elephants come into the camp, and the females are tied out at night so that they can be mounted by the male. And then all of these offspring become the next generation of patrol elephants or NTNC elephants in Nepal. The sad thing is that once they are born, they are no longer considered wild animal in the eyes of the Nepalese. So that is part of the problem, is that CITES protects international trade in endangered species, but is somewhat a gray area for these species that have been born in captivity. The other issue is that, while it is illegal to trade elephants across the border with India, it is still a very common practice, and those regulations are rarely enforced. So we do have elephants going in and out of Nepal on a regular basis despite legalities. This is just a picture of a juvenile at the breeding center. So one of the things that I wanted to examine in my research is the motivations behind the NGOs that are involved in Nepal and why they felt that they had sort of a right or an interest in the elephants of Nepal, since a lot of these organizations are international. I wanted to look at how each of these organizations did conservation and how they came to believe that they knew what was right for these elephants. Another thing that I wanted to determine is how these groups communicated with each other or failed to communicate with each other, and find some sort of a common language or a common ground for conservation. Like I said, the tourist elephant situation in Nepal is very unique compared to other parts of the world. And it's especially interesting that all of the privately held individuals belong to a single owner's co-op with the exception of one owner, which means that it is possible in future work to maybe come to an agreement with these owners that would change the welfare of elephants in Nepal. So when I first started researching back in 2012, there was very little talk of stopping elephant safaris at all. However, on my most recent fieldwork trip, I found out that discontent had been brewing among the local communities in Nepal. I came across 3 or 4 organizations that claimed that they were building the first sanctuary in Nepal. And I also came across quite a few grassroots organizations that were interested in stopping tourist elephant-back safari. So now there are numerous groups working to end tourism safari. But the problem is that Nepal is very reliant upon this tourist income. About 7% of Nepal's gross domestic product comes from tourism, and about 1 million Nepalese are employed somehow in the industry. So any conversation that we have regarding ending any sort of tourism trade has to be undertaken with some reflexivity as to how we can change things without greatly impacting the people who are reliant on this industry. So one problem that I found with the NGOs active in Nepal is that a lot of them had a personal experience with an elephant during a visit, decided that they needed to fix the elephant situation, and therefore formed an NGO and returned to Nepal again and again trying to fix the elephant situation. What happened, though, is that a lot of these people have absolutely no elephant experience, be it veterinary or zoological, and so they sort of go into this situation blind. One of the big problems is that there is this myth of a very large sanctuary, that somehow, if we all just work together, we would be able to let the elephants go into one great big field and everything would work out well. Sadly, another thing that is overlooked by a lot of these organizations is that the veterinary staff are the people who know these elephants the best. They know which elephants get along. They know which elephants are healthy enough to live in groups, yet no one ever consults them when they start talking about a sanctuary plan. Another issue that I ran across is that very few of the NGOs have any interest in talking to elephant owners, yet they want to obtain these elephants from the owners. So rather than setting up a cooperative agreement and trying to work with owners, they've set up an adversarial relationship. The owners don't want to talk to the activists don't want to talk to the owners, and they regularly complain to me about each other. Okay. So where did I end it? Well, I had a meeting with all of the NGOs and the owners and the veterinary staff, and we tried to sit down and have a conversation about the potential for building an elephant sanctuary in Nepal. And it wasn't as well accepted as I initially thought. It was the NTNC veterinarian that asked that everyone get together. So we did sit down, and as it turns out, the biggest problem with elephant sanctuaries in Nepal is ego. And that is that everyone wants to have the first and the best and the biggest sanctuary. And what keeps happening is people are developing their own little private heaven instead of looking at the bigger picture. This is not to say that there haven't been organizations that have been successful in improving the health and welfare of captive elephants. There are two organizations in particular that have successfully transitioned elephants to sanctuary situations, either by purchasing or by leasing. These organizations have demonstrated to owners that alternatives to elephant-backed safari are available. Thanks to concerted efforts on the part of a few dedicated individuals, some of the organizations are now communicating with owners and working together toward our common goal of happier and healthier elephants. The second half of my research was to undertake those visits to the 25 private stables, government stables, the NTNC stables, and these led me to create a welfare checklist, which was based on hundreds of sources from around the world, which could be applied to the unique situation in Nepal. I discovered that while the majority of owners and mahouts wanted to provide good or better conditions for their elephants, very few met even the most basic health and welfare standards. I found that most individual elephants suffered from a combination of chronic disease, painful foot problems, saddle wounds, issues relating to inadequate nutrition and husbandry, and many of these could be impacted positively with only a few small, inexpensive changes. I have received approval from owners to continue my work within the stables of Nepal, and I will return later this year for another project to improve elephant health and welfare with the blessing of the Elephant Owners Cooperative. I wanted to show you just a few photos of some elephant stables, what's a standard stable in Nepal. As you can see, they generally have 4 wooden posts and a metal roof. And the elephants are chained by 1 or 2 legs to a single post in the back, a single post in the front, or both. One of the simple changes that we could make would be to expand the footprint of these stables and add a center post so that these elephants could be chained in a way that they could move around the post and were not stuck in one spot. One of the reasons we see these chronic foot problems in the elephants of Nepal is that they are standing still in one place on hard-packed dirt whenever they're not on safari. Because of where the posts are located, these elephants stand in very unnatural positions, and they end up putting weight on different toes that's not natural, end up with cracks in their feet and a lot of foot infections. Okay. One of the other services that I offered when I was in Nepal was working with the NTNC veterinary staff going around and doing foot checks on these captive elephants. This is a photo of us performing some foot care on a captive elephant. In the wild, elephants are always in motion. They're digging with their feet, they're turning over dirt, they're scratching, they're itching, they're picking up sticks to clean their feet. And when they're in captivity, they don't have the opportunity to stand on soft dirt, move through mud, and take care of their own feet. So you are required to do a lot of foot care just to keep these feet functional and not painful. I also wanted to tell you about some work that I've done with the NTNC Wildlife Hospital in Nepal. I'm involved with a conservation group who was asked by the government veterinarian to help fund, with the WWF, the first wildlife hospital in Nepal. We did some fundraising, and it was finished last year. When I was out there as part of my work, I went through the hospital with the veterinarian to sort of see what equipment they needed, what sorts of treatments they would be able to provide, and just offered some general advice on running a veterinary hospital. We've since sent out several other veterinary technicians to help assess the situation, and it sounds like after 4 years of building, we are now ready to open the wildlife hospital. A second event that I've been involved in is an elephant health camp. Very little data exists on the baseline studies for the elephants in Nepal. Many of them have never had their microchip recorded. Many of them do not have registration papers. And so what Dr. Amir Sadallah wanted to do was run a camp, get some baseline data on weights and girths, basic blood work, fecal exams. So part of my experience in Nepal was finding funding for him to proceed with this health camp. We will be sending out some people at the end of this year, some veterinary technicians, some farriers, some veterinary staff to help the NTNC provide baseline studies for these privately owned elephants. So I've launched a website in an attempt to share my experiences in Nepal, share some of my photos, and share some of my research. That website is internationalelephants.org. It's also a place where you can send me any questions if you have any about the presentation today, or if you want to know more about traveling within Nepal or visiting elephants. Thank you so much for joining us today. Back to you, Daryl.
Michelle, thank you for that intimate insight into the lives of those magnificent beasts. Would you like to follow up with questions or your own observations for Michelle Szydlowski? Feel free to send your questions or comments to beaconsalon@beaconcollege.edu. And that concludes this edition of the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. Join us in the fall for the 4th season of the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. Visit the Beacon College website at beaconcollege.edu/salon for the latest up-to-date listings on when the series returns, and hopefully when it returns in person. Until then, for the lecturers that grace the program this season and for the Lakefront team, I'm Daryl Owens. Thank you for spending some quality time with us.